Welcome back to Haunted Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 7 true disturbing stories from remote camping locations across North America. These are tales of people who ventured into isolated wilderness and found something they were never meant to see. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. The Bitterroot Mountains stretch across the Idaho-Montana border like a sleeping giant's spine, all jagged peaks and valleys so deep they hold onto winter until June. My dad used to take me up there every summer when I was a kid, back when he was still trying to teach me to appreciate silence. I never really got it then, always brought my Game Boy, always complained about the mosquitoes. But at 32, after a divorce that left me sleeping on my sister's couch in Spokane, I finally understood what he meant about needing to get away from everything. I picked a trailhead near Darby on a Wednesday in late September. The parking area was empty except for a faded F-150 with a flat tire that looked like it had been there since spring. The air smelled like pine needles and that particular coldness that comes right before the season turns. I'd planned a 3-day loop, nothing too ambitious, just enough to clear my head. My pack was probably too heavy. I'd brought an extra fleece I definitely didn't need and a camp chair that seemed stupid the moment I shouldered everything. But I figured I'd rather have too much than not enough. The first few hours were perfect. That's what I remember most clearly, how perfect it all felt. The trail wound through stands of lodgepole pine and across meadows gone gold with autumn. I passed a creek where the water ran so clear I could count the stones on the bottom. Around mile 4, I stopped to filter some water and ate half a sandwich that tasted better than any meal I'd had in months. A raven called from somewhere above me, that throaty sound they make, and I called back at it like an idiot. For the first time since Emily left, I felt something close to okay. I reached my planned campsite around 5, a flat spot near a glacial lake that my dad's old guidebook promised would be empty this time of year. The book was right. The whole basin felt untouched, like I was the first person to stand there, even though I obviously was. I set up my tent facing the water, gathered wood, got my food bag ready to hang. All the things you're supposed to do. I'd brought a flask of bourbon, and I sat in my stupid camp chair watching the light change on the water, sipping it and feeling proud of myself for actually following through on this trip. The sun set behind the peaks around 7:30, and the temperature dropped fast. I'm talking about that mountain cold that finds every gap in your layers. I'd started a fire, nothing fancy, just enough to warm my hands and heat some water for the freeze-dried chili I'd brought. I don't know why, but I'd been putting off eating for at least an hour, just sitting there watching the flames. When I finally poured the boiling water into the packet, the smell made my stomach turn. It wasn't the food, it was something else. Something underneath it. That's when I noticed how quiet everything had gotten. The wind had died completely. No birds, no insects, even though there'd been plenty earlier, just the crackle of my fire and the sound of my own breathing. I told myself it was just because of the cold, that animals bedded down or whatever when the temperature dropped. But I've been camping enough to know what normal silence sounds like, and this wasn't it. I ate my chili anyway, forcing down the rubbery chunks of beef and beans while my fire burned lower. The darkness around me felt thicker than it should have, like it was pressing in on my little circle of light. I kept glancing at the tree line maybe 30 yards behind my tent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows between those pines were arranged wrong somehow. Too uniform, too still. Around 9, I heard the first sound that didn't come from me or my fire. A crack, like someone stepping on a branch. I froze with my spork halfway to my mouth. The sound came from behind me from those trees. I waited, counting my heartbeats. Nothing. I went back to eating, but I couldn't taste the food anymore. The second crack came 5 minutes later from a different spot, closer, maybe 20 yards out. I stood up then slowly, trying to look casual even though nobody was around to see me. My fire had burned down to coals, and I fed it a few more sticks, building it back up. Light felt important suddenly. I pulled out my headlamp and swept the beam across the tree line, but all I saw was pine trunks and darkness. "Hello?" I called out, feeling stupid immediately. My voice sounded too small. Nobody answered. I decided I was being paranoid, that I'd been alone too long and was psyching myself out. I hung my food bag, put out my fire properly, and retreated to my tent around 10. I lay in my sleeping bag with my headlamp on, reading a paperback western I'd brought, but not absorbing any of the words. Every few minutes, I'd stop and listen. The silence remained absolute. I must have dozed off around midnight because I woke up suddenly to a sound right outside my tent. Not at the door, at the back wall, the side facing the trees. A soft scraping, like fingernails dragging across the nylon. The kind of sound that pulls you from sleep directly into terror with no transition. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The scraping continued, 3 long strokes from top to bottom. Then it stopped. I waited in the darkness, my headlamp switched off now because some animal part of my brain had decided being seen was worse than not seeing. My heart hammered so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. Then the breathing started. Slow, wet, heavy breathing right against the tent wall, close enough that the fabric moved slightly with each exhale. It wasn't animal breathing. The rhythm was wrong, too measured, almost theatrical. Like someone was breathing at me, wanting me to know they were there. I lay frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably 10 minutes. The breathing continued, never changing pace, never moving. Then it stopped as suddenly as it had started. I waited in the silence, every muscle tensed, my hand wrapped around the bear spray I'd pulled from the tent pocket. Nothing. I don't know what made me finally turn on my headlamp and check my phone. 3:15 in the morning. I pulled up my maps, but of course I had no signal, and the GPS just showed a blue dot in a sea of green topographic lines. I was 8 miles from the trailhead. The nearest road was probably 12 miles through wilderness. I made myself wait until first light. It was the longest 3 hours of my life. I kept the headlamp on, pointed at the tent door, and I didn't sleep. Several times I heard movement in the forest, branches snapping, what might have been footsteps circling my camp. But nothing touched the tent again. Nothing breathed at me. When the sky finally started to lighten around 6:30, I'd already packed everything I could reach without leaving my sleeping bag. I took down my tent in record time, stuffing it into its sack without bothering to fold it properly. My hands shook as I shouldered my pack. The morning was gray and cold, mist hanging over the lake. I turned to start back down the trail, and that's when I saw it. Someone had arranged stones in a perfect circle around where my tent had been. Small white stones, maybe 30 of them, evenly spaced. They definitely hadn't been there yesterday, I would have noticed. Each stone had been placed deliberately, carefully, probably while I was sleeping. Before the breathing, I ran. I'm not proud of it, but I ran. 8 miles with a 40-pound pack, stumbling over roots, my lungs burning in the thin air. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and even then I kept looking back at the trailhead while I threw my gear into the trunk. I drove straight through to Spokane, 5 hours without stopping. My sister asked me why I was back early, and I told her I'd tweaked my knee. She didn't believe me, I could see it in her face, but she didn't push it. I still have the photos from that trip on my phone. The lake, the mountains, the perfect sunset. In one of them, a shot of my camp I took right after setting up. There's something in the tree line behind my tent. I didn't notice it until a week later when I was scrolling through. It's too dark and blurry to make out details, but there's definitely a shape there, taller than the surrounding brush, perfectly still among the pines. I've zoomed in 100 times. The proportions aren't quite right. The torso is too long, or maybe the legs are too short. I can't tell if it's looking at the camera or away from it. I deleted the photo eventually, but I remember it. And sometimes, late at night in my apartment, I hear that same wet, measured breathing just for a moment, and I have to turn on every light in the place before I can convince myself I'm alone. Story 2. My friend Kenji and I had been planning the Algonquin Park trip since January. We'd met in grad school, both of us studying ecology, and we'd been talking about doing a proper backcountry canoe route for years. The kind where you paddle all day and portage between lakes and don't see another human for a week. His girlfriend thought we were insane. It was early October, the park would be nearly empty, and the weather forecast was calling for rain, but that was exactly why we wanted to go. We put in at Lake Opiongo on a Friday morning, the sky low and threatening but not actually raining yet. The outfitter who rented us the canoe was a woman in her 60s with hands like leather. She barely looked at us when we signed the waiver. "You boys know what you're doing?" she asked. Kenji showed her our route plan, a 4-day loop through some of the more remote lakes. She studied it for a long moment. "That's Praux Lake territory," she said, tapping the map with a tobacco-stained finger. "People don't camp there much anymore." "Why not?" I asked. She just shrugged and handed us our paddles. "Weather's turning, be smart." The first day was long but good. We made 3 portages, each one leaving my shoulders burning and my legs shaking. Kenji was in better shape than me. He actually trained for this kind of thing, and I could tell he was slowing down to match my pace. By late afternoon, we reached Praux Lake, a narrow body of water hemmed in by steep hills covered in spruce and tamarack. The whole place had a closed-in feeling, like the trees were leaning toward the water. We found a campsite on the northern shore, a flat area with an established fire ring and a cleared spot for tents. Someone had left a neat stack of firewood under a tarp, which seemed like good luck until Kenji pointed out how old the tarp looked. "This wood's been here for years," he said, pulling back the plastic. The logs underneath were gray with age, dry as paper. Why would someone leave it? I didn't have an answer. We set up our tents. We'd each brought our own, both of us being the kind of people who needed our own space, and got a fire going with the old wood. It burned hot and fast, throwing sparks into the darkening sky. We cooked ramen and canned chili, mixing them together in a pot because Kenji swore it was better that way. He was wrong, but I ate it anyway. The rain the outfitter had predicted never came. Instead, the sky cleared as the sun set, revealing more stars than I'd seen since I was a kid visiting my grandmother in rural Oregon. "This is perfect," Kenji said, leaning back against a log. "This is exactly what we needed." I agreed. My phone had died the day before. I'd forgotten to charge it before we left, and Kenji had turned his off to save battery. No emails, no news, no constant stream of bullshit, just the fire and the lake and the sound of a loon calling from somewhere in the darkness. We stayed up later than we should have, finishing the flask of whiskey Kenji had brought. Around 11, we finally called it, letting the fire burn down to embers. I crawled into my tent, stripped down to my thermals, and was asleep before I could even zip my sleeping bag all the way up. I woke to Kenji shouting my name. "David, David, wake up." I fumbled for my headlamp, heart racing, completely disoriented. The tent was pitch black. I found the lamp and switched it on, the beam swinging wildly as I scrambled for the zipper. What's wrong? "Get out here, now." His voice had an edge I'd never heard before. I shoved my feet into my boots without lacing them and stumbled out into the night. Kenji was standing by the remains of our fire, his own headlamp beam pointed at the woods behind our camp. "What is it?" "Listen," he said. I stopped moving and held my breath. At first, I didn't hear anything unusual. The lake lapping at the shore, wind in the trees. Then I caught it, a voice, distant but clear, calling from somewhere in the forest. It was calling my name. "David, David." The voice was wrong. It had the rhythm of my name, the right number of syllables, but the tone was off, flat, emotionless, like someone who'd never said my name before trying to approximate the sound of it. "What the fuck?" I whispered. "It's been doing that for 5 minutes, Kenji said. "It was calling my name before. Now it's calling yours." We stood there listening as the voice called out every 20 seconds or so. Always my name. Always from the same spot in the forest, maybe 50 yards inland. Never getting closer, never getting farther away. Could it be another camper? I asked, knowing it wasn't but needing to say something. At 2 in the morning, calling our names, Kenji's jaw was set tight. No way. The calling continued. "David, David." Something about the cadence reminded me of a children's toy running out of batteries, the way the sound gets slower and deeper and wrong. "We should," I started, but Kenji cut me off. "Look." He'd shifted his headlamp beam to the tree line, sweeping slowly from left to right. I did the same with mine. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just spruce trunks and undergrowth and shadow. Then the beams crossed over something that reflected the light back at us. Eyes, but not animal eyes with that typical eye sheen. These were different, too large, too far apart, too high off the ground. They reflected our lights with a dull silver color, like tarnished mirrors. They didn't blink. They didn't move. "David, David." The voice was coming from exactly where the eyes were. My mouth had gone completely dry, like I'd swallowed a handful of sand. Kenji grabbed my arm. "We need to leave. Now, pack everything. It's the middle of the night. We can't paddle in the dark." "I don't care. We're leaving." We moved fast, throwing our gear into our packs without organizing anything. The whole time, the voice kept calling. My name, then Kenji's name, alternating. "David, Kenji, David, Kenji." Always the same flat tone, always from the same spot. The eyes never moved, never blinked, just watched us with that unnatural stillness. It took us maybe 15 minutes to break camp. We dragged the canoe to the water's edge, loaded our packs, and pushed off. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the paddle. Kenji took the stern position, steering us away from shore. Neither of us said a word. As we paddled into the darkness of the lake, I made the mistake of looking back one more time. My headlamp beam swept across the campsite we just abandoned, and I saw it clearly for the first time. It was standing at the edge of our camp. Tall, maybe 7 feet, maybe more. It was hard to judge distance in the dark. The body was wrong, proportioned like someone had tried to build a person from memory and gotten all the ratios slightly off. The arms hung past where the knees should have been. The legs bent backward at what I thought was the knee, but might have been something else. The head was oval, smooth, featureless, except for those large, reflective eyes. It didn't move as we paddled away. It just stood there, watching. When we finally rounded a bend and trees blocked our view, I heard the voice one last time, much louder now, as if it had finally figured out the right volume. David, K-N-J-I, David, K-N-J-I. Then silence. We paddled for 3 hours in complete darkness, neither of us willing to stop. We ran aground twice on sandbars and once nearly capsized when Kenji misjudged a turn. When the sky finally started to lighten around 5:30, we were on a completely different lake. I'm still not sure which one, and we both collapsed in the canoe, too exhausted to even make it to shore. We paddled out to the access point that day, skipping the rest of our route. The woman at the outfitter didn't ask why we were back early. She just looked at us with something like understanding and said, "Praux Lake." We nodded. "You boys are lucky," she said, taking the canoe paddle from my hands. The last group that camped there didn't come back. Kenji asked her what she meant, but she'd already turned away, dragging the canoe toward the storage rack like we weren't even there. I still have the route map we used. When I got home and looked at it properly in good light, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Someone had written in pencil, very small, in the margin next to Praux Lake, "Don't answer if you hear your name." A story 3. I inherited my uncle's cabin in the Cascades 3 years ago. We hadn't been close. He was my mom's brother, and they'd had some kind of falling out before I was born. So it surprised everyone when his lawyer called to tell me I was getting the property. 2 acres and a small A-frame about 40 minutes past Rosslyn, Washington, up a Forest Service road that barely qualified as drivable. I didn't visit it for almost a year. Life got in the way, my job, my girlfriend at the time, just general inertia. But after Vanessa and I split up and my lease in Seattle was coming due, I started thinking about the cabin more seriously. Maybe I could fix it up, rent it out on Airbnb or something. At the very least, I should probably check on it, make sure it wasn't falling apart. I drove up on a Saturday in late March, following the directions the lawyer had given me. The road was worse than I'd expected, full of potholes and washouts from the winter. My Subaru scraped bottom at least 3 times. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by old-growth Douglas fir, the kind of trees that make you feel small just looking at them. The structure itself was in better shape than I'd feared. The roof looked solid and the windows were intact, but clearly nobody had been there in years. The porch was covered in needles and cones. Door was locked, and it took me 20 minutes to find the key the lawyer had sent, which I'd thrown in my glove compartment and forgotten about. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, but basically sound. One main room with a kitchenette, a sleeping loft, a bathroom that probably didn't work, furniture covered in sheets, a wood stove that looked like it dated from the 70s. My uncle's stuff was still everywhere: books, camping gear, boxes of papers and photographs I'd have to sort through eventually. I spent the afternoon cleaning, opening windows, sweeping out mouse droppings and spiderwebs. In one of the closets, I found a shelf full of journals, all of them in my uncle's handwriting. I flipped through a few, mostly nature observations, bird sightings, weather notes, that kind of thing, boring stuff. But in the most recent one, the entries got weird. The last few pages were all about sounds he kept hearing at night: scratching, tapping, footsteps on the porch when nobody was there. The final entry was dated 2 weeks before he died. It knows I can hear it now. I think it's been waiting for me to acknowledge it. I was wrong to build here. This was already claimed. I closed the journal and put it back on the shelf. My uncle had been old, probably not entirely stable at the end. People heard things living alone in the woods, wind, animals, their own imagination. I decided to stay the night. I'd brought a sleeping bag just in case and drive back to Seattle in the morning. The sun set around 7 and the temperature dropped fast. I got the wood stove going after a few false starts, fed it some of the split wood I'd found stacked against the outside wall. The cabin warmed up quickly. I made ramen on the gas camp stove I'd brought, ate it watching the fire through the stove's glass door. Around 9 I heard the first tap, 3 soft knocks on the front door. Tap, tap, tap. I got up and opened it, expecting maybe a hiker or a Forest Service ranger. Nobody there. Just the porch and the clearing beyond, dark now except for the thin moonlight filtering through the trees. I stood in the doorway for a minute, listening. The forest was quiet, no wind, no animals moving. I closed the door and went back to the stove. Probably a branch falling, I told myself, or a pinecone hitting the roof. 10 minutes later, tap, 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 same pattern, same location. I walked to the door more slowly this time, trying to be quiet, thinking maybe I'd catch whoever was messing with me. I yanked it open fast. Nothing, nobody. But this time I noticed something I'd missed before. The porch boards directly in front of the door were clean, not dusty like the rest of the porch. Like someone had been standing there often enough to wear away the dust and needles. I left the door open and grabbed the flashlight from my pack. I swept the beam across the clearing into the trees. Nothing moved. Nothing reflected the light back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just outside the flashlight's reach, staying in the darkness, watching. I went back inside and locked the door. Then I pushed the old couch against it, which felt stupid and paranoid, but also necessary. I climbed up to the sleeping loft and got into my sleeping bag fully clothed, my flashlight next to me, my phone, which had no signal, clutched in my hand like it might somehow help. The tapping started again around 11. Not on the door this time. On the walls, moving around the cabin in a slow circuit. Tap, tap, tap on the north wall. A pause. Tap, tap, tap on the east wall. Another pause. Tap, tap, tap on the south wall. Like something was walking around the building, testing it, learning its boundaries. I lay frozen in the loft, barely breathing. The tapping continued its circuit 3 times, 4 times, then it stopped. The scratching started maybe an hour later. Long, slow drags down the outside of the walls. Wood on wood, or maybe something harder. The sound made my teeth ache. It went on for what felt like hours, never in the same place twice, never settling into a pattern I could predict. I didn't sleep at all. Around 5 in the morning, when the sky started to lighten and I could see the shapes of the trees through the windows, the sounds finally stopped. I waited another hour before I climbed down from the loft, moved the couch, and opened the door. The porch was covered in scratches, deep gouges in the wood, running vertically down the boards in sets of 4. They were fresh. I could see pale wood where the weathered gray surface had been torn away. The scratches started at the door and radiated outward, dozens of them, like something had been clawing at the entrance for hours. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the window on the south side of the cabin. I'd left it open the day before to air the place out, and I'd forgotten to close it before dark. The screen was torn, hanging in shreds, and on the windowsill, pressed into the dust, was a handprint. I say handprint, but it wasn't really. It had too many fingers, 6, maybe 7, it was hard to count. Each digit too long, too thin, ending in what looked like points. The print was huge, easily twice the size of my own hand. I took a picture of it with my phone. Then I got in my car and drove back to Seattle, watching my rearview mirror the entire way, convinced something was following just out of sight. I haven't been back to the cabin. I tried to sell it. But the real estate agent said there's no market for remote properties that far from amenities. It just sits there now, empty. Sometimes I get mail from the county about property taxes, and I think about just letting them take it for non-payment. But I keep paying, and I don't know why. A few months ago, I was going through old photos on my phone and found the picture I'd taken of that handprint. But in the background of the photo, visible through the torn screen, there's something standing in the trees about 30 yards from the cabin. It's partially obscured by branches, but you can make out a shape. Tall, wrong proportions. At first I thought it was a trick of shadow and light, but I've looked at that photo 100 times now, and I'm certain it's waving. The story 4. The Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas is bigger than most people realize. Nearly 2 million acres of mountains and hollows and places that don't appear on trail maps. My girlfriend Isabella and I decided to camp there over Thanksgiving weekend, partly because we wanted to avoid our families and partly because she'd found this online forum where people shared coordinates for unofficial campsites. Off-trail, primitive, the kind of places you couldn't reach without serious hiking. We picked a spot someone had posted about back in 2019. The forum user, Ridge Runner 88, had described it as the most isolated camp in the Ouachitas and included GPS coordinates and a cryptic note. You'll know you're close when you see the markers. Don't go past them after dark. We laughed about that. Isabella had a dark sense of humor, and we spent the first hour of our drive making up increasingly ridiculous explanations for what the markers might be. Scarecrows, tiki torches, garden gnomes. By the time we parked at a trailhead near Broken Bow Lake, we'd forgotten about it entirely. The hike in took most of the day. We had to bushwhack for the last 2 miles, following a compass bearing through dense oak and hickory. My legs were covered in scratches from brambles. Isabella twisted her ankles slightly on loose rocks, and we had to stop 3 times for her to wrap it. By the time we found the campsite, it was past 4 and the light was already getting thin. The site was exactly as described, a small flat area on a ridge, surrounded by forest on 3 sides and dropping off sharply to the north. Someone had built a fire ring from stacked stones, and there were a few logs arranged as benches. It looked abandoned but maintained, if that makes sense. Like people used it regularly, but nobody was taking care of it. We set up our tent and got organized, moving fast because we could feel the temperature dropping. November in Arkansas isn't brutal, but it gets cold at night, especially at elevation. I gathered firewood while Isabella filtered water from a spring we'd passed about a quarter mile back. The sun set around 5:30 and we had our fire going by 6. "This is perfect," Isabella said, leaning against me. "We should have done this years ago." I agreed. We'd been together for 4 years, and we'd always talked about camping but never actually done it. Too busy with work, with grad school, with life. Now here we were finally in the middle of nowhere, and it felt right. We cooked pasta on Isabella's camp stove and ate it with olive oil and garlic salt, drinking red wine from a flask. The fire burned hot and bright. Stars came out, more than I'd ever seen living in Little Rock. Around 8, Isabella pointed to a gap in the trees to our west. "What's that?" I looked where she was pointing. There were shapes between the trees, maybe 40 yards from our camp. Straight lines, too geometric to be natural. I grabbed my flashlight and walked closer to investigate, with Isabella following behind me. They were markers. Wooden stakes about 4 feet tall driven into the ground in a rough semicircle that wrapped around the western side of our campsite. Someone had wrapped white cloth around the tops of each stake, old bandages maybe or torn sheets. The cloth moved slightly in the breeze. There were 7 stakes total. "Ha," Isabella said, like Ridgerunner said. "Markers." We stood there looking at them. In the flashlight beam, they just looked sad and weathered, the wood grey with age. But there was something deliberate about their placement, something that suggested boundary. "Don't go past them after dark," I quoted, trying to sound casual. "It's already dark," Isabella pointed out. We went back to the fire. Neither of us mentioned the markers again, but I noticed Isabella kept glancing toward them. The white cloth flags were just barely visible in the firelight, moving like slow breaths. We stayed up until 11, talking and drinking and feeding the fire. It was one of those perfect nights where you remember why you fell in love with someone. When we finally decided to turn in, the fire had burned down to coals, and the temperature had dropped enough that I could see my breath. I was almost asleep when Isabella grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. "Marcus, do you hear that?" I held my breath and listened. At first, nothing. Then I caught it singing, a woman's voice, distant but clear, coming from somewhere beyond the markers. It wasn't English. Maybe not any language, just a melody, wordless and slow, rising and falling in a way that made my chest feel tight. "What the hell?" I whispered. The singing continued for maybe 2 minutes, then stopped abruptly. We lay there in the dark tent, waiting. The silence that followed felt worse than the singing, heavy, expectant. "Should we?" Isabella started, but I cut her off. "No, we're not going out there." We must have lain awake for an hour, barely moving, listening to the forest. Nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. I woke to daylight and the sound of Isabella unzipping the tent. "Hey," I called, still groggy. "Where are you going?" "Bathroom," she said, and disappeared. I lay there for a few minutes, gradually becoming aware that something felt off. The tent seemed too bright. I checked my watch, 8:30. We slept late. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and poked my head out of the tent. Isabella was standing at the edge of camp, looking toward the markers. She was completely still, her back to me, wearing just her thermals and camp shoes. "Babe," I called, "you okay?" She didn't respond, didn't turn around. I climbed out of the tent and walked over to her, my boots unlaced, stumbling slightly. "Isabella." When I got close enough to touch her shoulder, she finally turned. Her face was blank, not scared, not confused, just empty. Her eyes didn't quite focus on me. "I need to go see," she said quietly. "See what?" She pointed past the markers, into the trees. "She's out there. She wants me to come." Ice water ran down my spine. Nobody's out there. We're miles from anyone. "I can hear her singing again," Isabella said. "Can't you hear it?" I couldn't. The forest was silent except for a few birds calling in the distance. I grabbed both of Isabella's arms. "Look at me. There's nothing out there. We need to pack up and leave." For a moment, her eyes cleared and she really looked at me. "Marcus, what?" Then they went distant again. "She's calling me. I should go." She tried to pull away from me toward the markers. I held on tight. "No, we're leaving right now." It took me 20 minutes to break down camp by myself, while keeping Isabella within arm's reach. She kept trying to walk toward the markers, not violently but persistently, like she was being drawn by a magnet. I had to physically guide her away 3 times. She didn't fight me exactly, but she didn't help either. It was like she was sleepwalking. I got everything packed and started leading her down the trail we'd come in on. She followed but kept looking back over her shoulder. A quarter mile from camp, she suddenly stopped and blinked like she was waking up. "Why are we hiking?" She asked. "Did we already camp?" "You don't remember?" "I remember setting up the tent. And the fire. Then she shook her head. Nothing. What happened? I told her about the singing, about finding her at the edge of camp, about how she'd tried to walk past the markers. She listened with growing horror. I don't remember any of that, she said. Marcus, I swear, I don't remember. We hiked out fast, barely stopping. Isabella's ankle had stopped bothering her. Adrenaline, probably. We reached the car around 2 in the afternoon and drove straight to a diner in Broken Bow, where we sat in a booth drinking bad coffee and trying to process what had happened. I pulled out my phone to check the photos I'd taken of the campsite. There were about a dozen: the fire, the sunset, Isabella smiling in her beanie. But there was one I didn't remember taking. The timestamp said 3:14 in the morning. It was a shot of the tent from outside, taken from maybe 15 feet away. You could see the silhouette of our bodies inside through the nylon. I never sleepwalked in my life, and I definitely didn't take that photo. Isabella looked at it and went pale. Someone was watching us. Something, I corrected. We tried to find that forum thread again to warn other people, but the entire forum was gone. The domain didn't even resolve. I searched for Ridge Runner 88 on other hiking sites and found nothing. It was like they'd never existed. Last week, Isabella told me she's been hearing singing when she's home alone. Always when I'm at work. Always the same melody. She started sleeping with headphones in, playing white noise. She won't talk about it, but I can see she's not sleeping well. Neither am I. I keep thinking about those markers, those white cloth flags moving in the darkness. And I keep thinking about what they were marking, what boundary we camped inside. The story 5. I worked for the Forest Service for 3 summers during college, mostly doing trail maintenance and fire watch in northern Minnesota. It was good money and better solitude. I'd spend weeks at a time in a fire tower, reading books and scanning the horizon for smoke. The kind of job that sounds romantic until you actually do it. My last summer, they assigned me to maintain a network of trails in the Boundary Waters Canoe area, a million-acre wilderness that butts up against Canada. The trails weren't well traveled, mostly access points for portages between lakes, and my job was to clear deadfall, mark routes, and report any issues. I worked alone, camping at different spots every few nights, moving through the wilderness with a chainsaw, a GPS unit, and enough food for 2 weeks at a stretch. In late August, my supervisor radioed with new coordinates. There was an old emergency shelter on the eastern edge of my patrol area that needed assessment for possible decommission. Could I hike out there, check its condition, take some photos? It would add 4 days to my circuit, but I didn't mind. Anything to break up the routine. The shelter sat on the shore of a narrow lake whose name I can't remember now. It took me 2 days to reach it, following game trails and old blaze marks that had mostly faded. When I finally found it, I understood why they were considering tearing it down. The structure was ancient, probably built in the 30s or 40s, just a 3-sided log lean-to with a corrugated metal roof. Half the roof had collapsed, and the logs were rotted through in places. I set up my tent about 30 yards away and spent the afternoon documenting the damage with my camera. The shelter had a dirt floor and a fire ring out front, long cold. Someone had carved names and dates into one of the logs. J. Winters, 1987, Tommy Chen, 1994, Alana Mitchell, 2003. The most recent was Larcn 2011, which surprised me. I wouldn't have thought anyone had used this place in the last decade. The sun set around 8:30, that long, slow northern sunset that takes forever. I cooked my usual dinner, instant mashed potatoes with tuna mixed in, trail mix, and apple going soft, and sat on a log watching the lake turn from blue to black. A loon called from somewhere in the darkness. Another answered. I felt the specific kind of contentment that comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. I was in my sleeping bag by 10, reading a Tom Clancy novel by headlamp. Around 11, I heard someone chopping wood. The sound was unmistakable, that rhythmic thunk of an axe biting into a log. It was coming from the direction of the shelter, maybe 40 yards away. I turned off my headlamp and listened. Thunk, 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 a pause. Then the sound of wood being split, that cracking noise as the grain separates. My first thought was that another ranger had shown up, which seemed unlikely but not impossible. Maybe someone else had been sent to assess the shelter. I turned my headlamp back on, pulled on my boots, and unzipped my tent. "Hello," I called out. "Forest Service. That you, Roger?" The chopping stopped. Silence. I waited, my breath fogging in the cool air. The silence stretched out too long. "Hello." Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, a big maglite that doubled as a club, and walked toward the shelter. The beam swept across the collapsed structure, the fire ring, the carved log. Nobody there. No fresh wood chips on the ground. No axe. The fire ring was cold and empty, just like it had been hours earlier. I stood there feeling foolish. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe a beaver had been chewing a tree somewhere nearby, and the sound had carried weird across the water. That happened sometimes in the boundary waters. Sounds traveling farther than they should, bouncing off water and stone. I went back to my tent and tried to sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to footsteps circling my camp. Not human footsteps. The rhythm was wrong, too quick, too light, like someone walking on their toes. They went around my tent 3 times, close enough that I should have heard breathing or seen a shadow against the tent wall. But there was nothing except those soft, rapid steps in the pine needles. Then they stopped directly outside my tent door. I lay frozen, my hand wrapped around my bear spray. The footsteps had been moving clockwise around my tent, and they'd stopped where the zipper was. Something was standing right there, inches from my head, separated only by thin nylon. I waited for breathing, for movement, for anything. The silence was absolute. Even the loons had gone quiet. After what felt like an hour but was probably 5 minutes, I heard the footsteps resume, moving away from my tent toward the lake. They didn't fade gradually, they just stopped, like whatever was making them had simply ceased to exist. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. When dawn finally came gray and cold around 6, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. I was supposed to spend 2 days documenting the shelter, taking measurements and more photos, but I didn't care. I'd file a report saying it needed to be demolished immediately, and they could send someone else to do the follow-up. I took one last look at the shelter before I left. In the early morning light, I noticed something I'd missed the day before. There was another name carved into the log, higher up and harder to see, fresh wood showing through like it had been carved recently. E. Winters, 2023. That was my name, Eric Winters, and 2023 was the current year. I stood there staring at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. I definitely hadn't carved it. I didn't carry a knife that could do that kind of work. And nobody else should have known I'd be here. I'd only gotten the assignment 3 days earlier, and I hadn't told anyone my exact route. I took a photo of it. Then I left, following my GPS back toward the main trail network. I didn't stop except to check my bearings. I covered 23 miles in 1 day, which was stupid with a full pack, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me just out of sight. When I got back to the ranger station, my supervisor asked how the assessment went. I told her the shelter was a loss and should be torn down. She asked if I'd taken photos. I said my camera had malfunctioned. She seemed annoyed but didn't push it. I never told her about the name, about the footsteps, about the wood chopping that came from nowhere, but I put in my notice the next day. I told everyone I'd gotten a better job offer, which was a lie. The truth was I couldn't go back out there. Couldn't sleep in a tent knowing that something might circle it in the darkness, might stand outside my door, might carve my name into wood while I was miles away. I still have that photo on an old hard drive somewhere. Sometimes I think about looking at it again, but I never do, because part of me is afraid that if I look, there will be more names carved below mine. Names of people who haven't visited that shelter yet, maybe haven't even been born. And if I saw my name there again, with a different date, a future date, I don't know what I'd do. A story 6. My brother Cowan and I took our dad's ashes to Mount Hood in late June. He asked us to scatter them somewhere on the mountain. He proposed to our mom there in 1989, and it was the place he talked about more than anywhere else. After the funeral and the reception, and all the exhausting social performance of grief, it felt good to have a concrete task. Drive to Oregon, hike up the mountain, say goodbye properly. We picked a trail on the less traveled east side, parking at a trailhead that was basically just a widened spot in a Forest Service road. The day was clear and warm, and the mountain rose above us like a white temple. Dad would have loved it. We didn't talk much as we hiked. Cowan and I had never been particularly close, and grief wasn't making us any chattier. We just walked, passing the urn back and forth, taking turns carrying it in a backpack. Around mile 5, we reached a saddle between two ridges that offered a clear view of the summit. It felt right. We stopped there, set down our packs, and Cowan took out the urn. It was strange holding it, this heavy ceramic container that was supposed to be our father. I expected to feel something profound, but mostly I just felt tired. We took turns saying things we thought we should say. Cowan talked about how Dad had taught him to fish. I mentioned the time Dad drove 6 hours to pick me up when my car broke down in Boise. Generic memories that felt inadequate, but were all we could manage. Then Cowan opened the urn, and we took turns tossing handfuls of ash into the wind. Some of it blew back into our faces, which would have made Dad laugh. We stood there for a long time after the urn was empty, not talking, just looking at the mountain. Finally, Cowan checked his watch. We should head back. It's past 4. The trail down was quiet. We passed one other hiker coming up, a woman in her 50s with expensive gear who nodded as we went by. Otherwise, we were alone. The sun was still high, but starting to angle toward the horizon, throwing long shadows through the firs. We were maybe 2 miles from the trailhead when Cowan stopped suddenly. "Did you lock the car?" "I thought you did." "No, you had the keys." I pulled them from my pocket and showed him. "I definitely locked it. I remember checking twice." "Okay, good." He seemed relieved. I just had this image of us getting back and finding someone had broken in. We kept walking. 10 minutes later, Cowan stopped again. "Did you lock the car?" I looked at him. "You just asked me that." He blinked. "Did I?" "Yeah, like 10 minutes ago. I showed you the keys." "I don't remember that," he said slowly. A weird feeling crawled up my spine. "Are you feeling okay?" "I'm fine. I'm fine, sorry." We walked in silence. The shadows were getting longer, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. I found myself walking faster, wanting to get off the mountain, though I couldn't have said why. The trail felt different somehow, narrower, the trees seemed closer. "Did you lock the car?" Cowan asked. I stopped and turned to face him. "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" "Asking about the car. That's the third time." He looked at me blankly. "I haven't asked about the car." "Cowan, you literally just..." "No," he said firmly. "You're confused. We haven't talked since that woman passed us on the trail." But we hadn't passed a woman, or had we? I tried to remember and found the memory slippery, uncertain. Yes, there had been a woman. She'd been going up, or coming down. I couldn't quite picture her face. "Something's wrong," I said. "You're just tired," Cowan said. "We both are. Let's just get to the car." We kept hiking, but now I was paying attention to everything. The trail didn't look right. There was a boulder I didn't remember passing, and the trees were different, more lodgepole pine than fir. The light had gotten dimmer, though the sun shouldn't have set for at least another hour. "Did you lock the car?" Cowan asked. "Stop it," I said. "You need to stop asking me that." "Asking you what?" He looked genuinely confused. I grabbed his arm. "We need to stop walking. Something is very wrong here." Cowan pulled away. "You're being paranoid. The trailhead is just ahead." "How do you know that?" "Because I can see it." He pointed down the trail. I looked where he was pointing and felt my stomach drop. There was something ahead of us, visible through the trees, but it wasn't the parking area. It was the saddle where we'd scattered Dad's ashes, the same rock outcrop, the same view of the summit. "We're going in circles," I whispered. "No, that's the parking area," Cowan insisted. "You can see my car." "That's not a car." "Cowan, look at it." He squinted down the trail. For a moment, his expression cleared, and I saw recognition, saw fear. Then it smoothed over again. "We should keep walking," he said. "Did you lock the car?" I started to panic. My brother was stuck in some kind of loop, asking the same question over and over, and we kept ending up back at the same place on the mountain. The light was wrong, the trail was wrong, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard a bird or felt the wind. I checked my phone. No signal, which was expected, but the time made no sense. It said 4:32, which was impossible. It had been past 4:30 when Cowan first asked about the car, and that felt like an hour ago. I watched the digits. They didn't change. The clock was frozen. "Cowan," I said carefully, "I need you to listen to me. We're not going to the parking area. We need to get off this trail. We need to go downhill toward the road, not following the trail." "That's stupid," he said. "The car is right there. Did you lock it?" "I made a decision." I grabbed Cowan's arm and pulled him off the trail into the forest, heading perpendicular to what I thought was downhill. He resisted at first, then followed, complaining that I was being crazy. I didn't care. We crashed through undergrowth, over fallen logs, sliding on loose scree. I kept moving downhill, always downhill, refusing to follow anything that looked like a trail. After maybe 20 minutes of this, Cowan stopped suddenly. "What are we doing? Where are we? Do you remember the last 10 minutes?" He looked around, blinking like he'd just woken up. "We are off trail. Why are we off trail? And why is it so dark?" The light had come back. Real light, natural light, the warm gold of late afternoon. And through the trees ahead, I could see the actual parking area. The Subaru was exactly where we'd left it, dust-covered and real. We stumbled out of the forest and to the car. I unlocked it with shaking hands. We both got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a long moment without speaking. Finally, Cowan said, "What the hell just happened?" "I don't know. I kept asking about the car, didn't I? Over and over." "Oh yeah. I don't remember it, any of it. Last thing I remember clearly is scattering the ashes, then everything is just blank." We drove away from there fast, neither of us looking back. We didn't talk about it for the rest of the drive to Portland, where Cowan lived. When I dropped him off, he said, "Maybe we shouldn't mention this to Mom." I agreed. What would we even say? It was only later, when I was back in Sacramento and trying to sleep, that I remembered something. When we'd gotten to the car, my door had been unlocked. I'd unlocked the driver's side with the key, but when Cowan tried his door, it was already open. I definitely locked both doors before we started hiking. I'm obsessive about it. But Cowan's door was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar, like someone had gotten out and not closed it all the way. And on the passenger seat, there was a small pile of ash. Not dust, ash. Like someone had been sitting there, waiting, and simply crumbled to nothing when we arrived. Story 7. Rachel and I had been planning the Appalachian Trail section hike for months. Not the whole trail, neither of us were that ambitious. Just a 5-day stretch through the Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. October seemed like perfect timing. The leaves would be turning, the crowds would be gone, and we both needed a break from the suffocating routine of our lives in Baltimore. We started at Rockfish Gap on a Wednesday morning, packs loaded, spirits high. The first 2 days were exactly what we'd hoped for: crisp autumn air, spectacular views, the quiet satisfaction of making miles. We saw a few other hikers, but not many. By Thursday night, we had the shelter at Black Rock Hut to ourselves. The shelter was standard trail stuff, a 3-sided wooden structure with a sleeping platform, a nearby privy, a bare box for food storage. We hung our packs, set up our sleeping bags on the platform, and cooked dinner as the sun set. Rachel made jokes about her terrible, dehydrated lasagna. I tried to start a fire, but the wood was damp. We gave up and retreated to our sleeping bags early, maybe 8:30, exhausted from the day's elevation gain. I woke around 2 in the morning to voices. At first, I thought other hikers had arrived late and were setting up nearby, but as I came fully awake, I realized the voices were wrong. There were too many of them, all talking at once in a low murmur that never resolved into distinguishable words. It sounded like a crowd whispering, dozens of overlapping conversations, all happening just outside the shelter. I reached over and shook Rachel's shoulder. She woke with a start. "What? Do you hear that?" She went still, listening. I watched her face change as she registered the sound. "What is that?" "I thought maybe other hikers, but..." "That's not hikers," she said flatly. We lay there listening to the murmuring voices. They seemed to come from all around the shelter, from the woods on 3 sides. Never loud enough to make out words, never quiet enough to ignore. The sound had a quality that made my skin crawl, artificial somehow, like a recording of voices rather than actual human speech. "Should we check it out?" Rachel whispered. "Absolutely not." We stayed in our sleeping bags. The volume rose slightly. Not a lot, just enough to be noticeable. The murmuring became more agitated, the overlapping voices more urgent. Then, without warning, it stopped completely. The silence was worse. We waited in the darkness, neither of us moving. My ears were ringing from the sudden absence of sound. No crickets, no wind, no night birds, just perfect, oppressive silence. Maybe they left, Rachel said finally. Maybe. We waited another 10 minutes, then Rachel sat up and grabbed her headlamp. I'm going to look. I can't just lie here. Bad idea. I'll just shine my light out there. I won't leave the shelter. She crawled to the open side of the shelter and turned on her headlamp. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and undergrowth. Nothing moved. Nothing was there. See, she said, nothing. She swept the light slowly from left to right, covering maybe 180 degrees of forest. About halfway through the sweep, the beam caught something that made us both freeze. There was a person standing in the trees about 40 feet from the shelter, perfectly still, perfectly silent, just standing there facing us. Rachel kept the light on them. It was hard to make out details from that distance, but something was off about the proportions. The person was tall, very tall, and thin in a way that didn't look right. The arms hung too low. The head seemed too small for the body, or maybe the body was too large for the head. Hello, Rachel called, her voice cracking slightly. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. Do you need help? She tried again. Nothing. The figure just stood there, caught in the headlamp beam like a photograph. Fuck this, I whispered. Turn off the light. Why? Just do it. Rachel switched off the headlamp. Darkness crashed back over us. We sat in the shelter, breathing hard, waiting to hear footsteps approaching or retreating, but there was nothing, just that same absolute silence. After a few minutes, Rachel turned her headlamp back on and aimed it at the same spot. The figure was closer, maybe 30 feet now instead of 40, still perfectly motionless, still staring at us. Oh shit, Rachel breathed. It moved. Turn off the light. She did. We waited in darkness again, and this time I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. When Rachel turned the light back on, the figure was 15 feet from the shelter. We could see it clearly now, and I wished we couldn't. It looked almost human, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but the details were wrong. The skin was too pale, almost gray. The joints bent at slightly incorrect angles. The face was smooth and featureless, like clay that hadn't been sculpted yet. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just blank pale flesh. It still hadn't moved while the light was on. But the math was inescapable. Every time we turned off the light, it got closer. Don't turn off the light, I said. My battery won't last all night. I don't care, keep it on. We both dug out our flashlights and headlamps, 4 lights total between us, and aimed all of them at the figure. In the combined beams, it looked even more wrong. I could see now that its skin had a texture like wax, smooth but not quite right. And though it had no eyes, I had the unshakable feeling that it was looking directly at us. We sat like that for hours, keeping the lights trained on the figure, taking turns holding them when our arms got tired. It never moved, never so much as swayed. It just stood there at the edge of our light, patient and impossible. Around 5 in the morning, the sky started to lighten. As the natural light increased, the figure began to look less solid somehow, more translucent. By the time the sun actually rose over the trees around 6, it was gone entirely. Not like it walked away, more like it had never been there at all. We packed our gear in silence and hiked out fast, doing 12 miles by noon. At the next shelter, we found a logbook where hikers left notes. We flipped through it, and on a page dated 3 years earlier, someone had written, "Black Rock Hut saw something in the woods. Very tall, pale, no face. Didn't sleep. Don't stay here at night." Below that, in different handwriting, we saw it too, stood there all night watching us. Same shelter. There were 4 other entries about the same thing, spread across different years. The most recent was from just 2 months earlier. It got within 5 feet of the shelter. Only thing that stopped it was keeping the lights on. Avoid this shelter. Rachel tore the page out of the logbook. We should report this to the park service. And say what? There's a ghost or a cryptid or something haunting one of their shelters. She didn't have an answer for that. We finished our hike, but cut it short by a day, neither of us willing to spend another night on the trail. When we got back to Baltimore, we tried to find other reports about Black Rock Hut online. There were a few scattered mentions on obscure forums, people describing similar experiences, always the same figure, always standing just outside the shelter, always getting closer when the lights went out. One post from 2017 had a detail that made my blood freeze. I took a photo of it with my phone. When I looked at the picture later, the figure wasn't there. But my camera settings showed the flash had fired. The flash fired at something, but nothing showed up in the image. Rachel still has that page from the logbook. Sometimes she talks about scanning it and posting it somewhere people will see it, warning others. But we never do, because part of me wonders if spreading the story might make it worse somehow. Like acknowledging it gives it more power. I haven't been backpacking since. Rachel went out once with some other friends last spring, but she chose a trail in Pennsylvania, nowhere near Virginia. She told me later that she couldn't sleep the first night, kept her headlamp on, and aimed at the trees until her battery died. Last month, I got a weird email from an address I didn't recognize. No subject line, the message just said, "It's still there, it's always there, and now there are 2 of them." I deleted it. I don't want to know more. But sometimes late at night, when I'm trying to fall asleep, I think about that blank wax face and those impossible proportions. And I think about how it moved in the darkness, closing the distance between us one light switch at a time. I wonder what would have happened if our batteries had died. If we'd been forced to sit in darkness while it finished its approach. I wonder if anyone has run out of light at Black Rock Hut since we were there. I wonder, but I don't want to find out. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.